Today, we are very excited to be joined by Professor David Krueger. He's an assistant professor at the University of Cambridge and a member of Cambridge's Computational and Biological Learning Lab and Machine Learning Group. His research group focuses on deep learning, AI alignment, and AI safety. Today, we are very excited. Oops, sorry, one second. Okay, yeah. And Professor Krueger is broadly interested in work, including in areas outside of machine learning, such as AI governance, that could reduce the risk of human extinction, also known as X risk, resulting from out of control AI systems. So please feel free to paste your questions into our chat on YouTube. And we will moderate those questions in, but we're very excited today. We have a list of some broad questions as well as some more technical questions that we're excited to get your thoughts on.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. Two things I want to mention quickly. Sorry, I probably provided that intro, but one thing is that I am no longer at Cambridge, so I left my job there a couple months ago, and I'm going to be joining Montreal, University of Montreal, where I did my graduate studies, and Mila as a professor this fall. So that's one update. The other is, I think the out-of-control AI systems is like too narrow compared to how I think about the problem and talk about it more these days. I think it conjures the image of like a single rogue superintelligence, and I think we almost equally well need to worry about sort of more slow motion human extinction scenarios where we sort of gradually automate ourselves away. So I think that's really important, risk as well, worth including.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying. So we're going to start off with this super broad question, which is just what does success in safety and alignment look like to you? Like if you could snap your fingers and make sort of anything happen, technical, non-technical, etc., what would that look like?
Yeah, I think defining success is part of the problem, and always has been, probably always will be. That's not a super cool answer though. The way that I've usually thought about this is like we have made a we have secured the space and time and ability for us to make a best effort at understanding what is important ethically, or what our values are, and yeah, sort of made decisions about how to proceed with developing superhuman AI systems, sort of having done that work of thinking about, what are the outcomes that we ultimately want to steer towards, or maybe what are the processes that we ultimately want to endorse for, choosing, how we direct the future to the extent that we're able to. So that's a very like ambitious and sort of philosophical or philosophically inclusive project. And when I imagine this, I think of it as something that might take many generations. Something that there really ought not to be too much time pressure to too much time pressure on, because I think it's a really big deal. And I think once we sort of start using superhuman AI systems, I think it's very difficult to have that not, start to radically reshape things in a way that may actually corrupt the processes that we might like to employ in order to better understand what is ethically valuable. So, to make that super concrete, we did some work about content recommendation and the prospects for content recommendation systems to manipulate user preferences in order to achieve higher reward or keep users engaged or whatever. And that's a specific instance of this more general problem where when you have a sort of agentic AI system that's trying to accomplish goals and it's interacting with humans in its environment, it's a natural thing for it to treat those humans as just another part of the state of the environment to be manipulated. And so to the extent that, we currently have some moral intuitions that are somewhat trustworthy, I think we would like to sort of protect those from that kind of influence. But as soon as we start to build powerful goal-directed AI systems and set them loose in the world, they will have a great potential to, corrupt those moral intuitions, and so in that sense, sort of rob us of ground truth about what is actually valuable from a ethical point of view.
Yeah. So given
So,
these,
and, and
oh,
I have like two other versions of answers to this question that I'm happy to give, but we can also, if there's a lot of questions, we can just move on.
yeah, we have another question kind of related to these like capabilities and safety
Cool.
aspect.
Yeah.
So, yeah, how do you view this balance between this development and capabilities and progress and safety? Do you think like the prior should pause as the other catch up? And recently, there's also this arguments like the ones made by Dario from Anthropic about how people often underestimate the upsides of improving model capabilities. So are you convinced by those arguments? How do you now view the balance?
I haven't seen that argument. I'm aware it exists. I would be quite surprised if I found it uh, convincing or to change my view very much, because I feel like, you know, yeah, I've just thought about it and talked about it a lot over the years. Yeah, I coming back to what I said previously. I mean, I think in some sense there's no rush here. Like, I think the only uh, yeah. So yeah, I think like the benefits of AI, like basically, first of all, I think it's just not clear if we set aside existential risk completely that the benefits will outweigh the costs. And I think that's a really important like point to emphasize. Um, and I'll say a little bit more about that as well. But yeah, I think existential risk is large and um, what's the word? Like potentially very imminent. So I think you know, when people talk about the benefits in the context of this conversation, I mostly feel like they are missing the point or have an incorrect model of the situation we're in. Like, I think we are, you know, I like to say it's like we're in a train that is, rushing towards the edge of a cliff and we need to slam on the brakes. And even if we slam on the brakes right now, it's not clear that we will slow down enough to avoid going off the cliff. So, maybe there's nice things about this train. And maybe if we like build a bridge to the other side of the cliff, then, it'll be great. And we should go ahead and, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like, I think we just urgently need to get some sort of control over the development of AI before doing anything else, basically, because right now it's being driven by competitive pressures that are completely out of control, competitive pressures between nations and between companies, and that's just a like extremely dangerous and untenable situation. So, like let's not even talk about the benefits. Let's just talk about how do we change this situation as quickly as possible. In terms of the other point, yes, because I want to return to this, it has often been people often describe the situation, including people within the AI safety community, as like we're either going to get dystopia or utopia, and like basically a lot of people in AI safety, I think, also, and maybe a lot of people who are broadly like techno optimist or techno progressive in some sense, are like, so long as this thing doesn't like go rogue and kill everyone, it's the utopia that we're going to be looking at here, like clearly. And I think that's just really not a given at all. So I think there's some clear like systematic effects that we should expect AI systems to have, sort of regardless. Okay, sort of regardless of how things go. So that includes like increasing inequality, increasing the ability to manipulate people and to convert, material wealth into influence, and then also sort of just dehumanizing the world in general, dehumanizing and commodifying, human behavior and interactions and relationships. And I think you can already see these trends active on a macro level throughout history. And AI is, I think, poised to dramatically accelerate them. And those seem like really important trends to account for. And then the last thing I would mention here is And I need to do my my research here more and actually look into his work more. But Darren Acemoglu just won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he's done work on this idea of so-so automation. So basically arguing that a lot of the promised economic benefits of automation have failed to materialize. We haven't seen it drive growth or standards of living in a massive way. It's mostly had an effect on inequality. And I think he's projected that AI technologies, I think mostly thinking about current AI technologies, so that's a major limitation of the work maybe, are likely to do the same. So when I hear people saying, AI is such a great technology that has so much amazing potential that we can't slow it down or stop it, you're getting in the way of progress, I'm like, very skeptical of that narrative.
Yeah, I think thanks for sharing your thoughts on all of that. I think it's nice to hear you connect it to a lot of different fields and kind of bring in different perspectives. So I kind of want to go back to something that you touched on before, which is like AI right now is driven, per your argument, like by selective pressures that are sort of not maybe what you want them to be or what they should be. And I was wondering, as someone who works on safety, how do you balance doing work that's more in, say, governance or philosophy versus doing technical work? And for you personally, how do you balance those things? And also, how do you think the field should consider these different approaches?
Yeah, I think we're massively overinvested in technical work, and that's starting to change, but it's still the case. I think, yeah, personally, I'm part of the problem in that sense, I guess. But I'm trying to change that. I'm really, um, yeah, planning to spend much less of my time on technical research and more time on some combination of like outreach, advocacy, activism, governance, and strategy. I think, yeah, personally, I'm most keen on like just raising awareness, basically. Like, I think we had a big step in that last year, but there's just still, we have so far to go, like, even within the field of machine learning, let alone like society at large. Um, and uh, yeah, so what I really want is, more people to understand and care about the problem. I think that's a critical, blocker for a lot of things that need to happen. Um, I do think it's partially a question of like, personal fit. But and it seems that, a lot of people historically interested in AI safety have been, like CS or math or STEM people, from a pretty narrow, you know, slice of disciplines and demographics. I think that's partially an issue of the sort of the community, that uh, we could have done and could be doing a better job to address. Like, I mean, I know, back in the day, a lot of people believed, and I think you can still encounter people who think that you sort of have to be a math genius in order to contribute anything here, which is just really, discouraging and disappointing that that's the message that people have gotten. I think, it's almost exactly the opposite is true, and has been for a while. It's like we need people with, other skills, like interpersonal skills, soft skills, other expertise, like, legal expertise, for instance, and people who have experience working with like, civil society, and have, networks and, relevant networks and skills and connections and everything. Yeah, so I generally encourage people, um, when I'm like asked to give advice on this, to like try to do something different, like do something that other people aren't doing. Don't just be like one more person working on mechanistic interpretability or going to like Anthropic or one of these other orgs or something. Like, think about, what you can do that is a little bit more out of the box, and is a little more like, you know, maybe high risk, high reward, or is going to, where you're going to really be exposed to new things, and you're going to expose the community to new things, and you're going to, sort of, make a difference that way. Because I think there's still not nearly enough of that happening. And, this isn't a problem that I think is, personally, I don't think it's going to be solved by like, you know, technical research, or like a small group of people sort of working unilaterally. I think we really need to figure out how to plug into the rest of society and like leverage all of the stuff that I mentioned, all the skills and talent and like networks and stuff that other people have. And that's part of why I'm so keen on like sort of winning hearts and minds or getting more people to understand and care about the problem, is because I don't think that there's a single easy obvious answer or solution. I think there's like a lot of things that need to happen in a lot of different places, and I think um, you know people are often in a much better position to understand what they can do to contribute to this problem than I am, given their unique situation, their skills and their network and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing those thoughts. Just wanted to ask a follow-up question. So, say that you have a group of people with these diverse set of skills together, and what might be some like concrete problems that you think is understudied right now, but could contribute to that grand goal?
Yeah. So I think a lot of a big thing that I am thinking about is like messaging and sort of communication about the issue. So like, how do we explain things to different audiences and sort of to as many people as possible in a way to get them to understand and care about the problem? And then how do we give them hope and inspiration to do something about the problem? Because it is something that is pretty daunting and depressing, and it's easy to just, be like, wow, that is just out of my hands. And, the only thing I can do is like hope and pray that it's going to, work out. And so yeah, I think that's a really, at a high level, something that I would like a lot more people to be thinking about and making progress on. I think there's also a lot of questions nowadays about like where exactly are risks emerging, and correspondingly, where are there opportunities now to intervene and start putting in place processes that will, you know, um, sort of control particular uh, like particular like use cases of AI, let's say, or particular domains, like and that's something where I think the AI ethics community is much more sort of up to speed or like ahead of the safety community, right? Is like they've been engaged with stuff that's happening on the ground a lot more for a long time. And I mean, I know like some people have also told me that that community is a little bit too academic, or maybe much too academic at times. But like when I have gone to the FACT conference, you do find that there are people showing up there more than I would say at AI safety events or like machine learning conferences, who are involved in civil society and are doing things about what's actually happening on the ground within some particular context or some particular community with AI. And like I guess people in the AI safety community, I think, tend to be skeptical that that sort of work is going to be that important or meaningful in my experience, because they don't see like how it connects to the big picture, issues of existential risk. And I think that that's maybe partially just like I don't know, lack of experience or lack of like a concrete model of how it happens, or like you won't necessarily like the connection is sometimes there just won't be any like connection, but like an expectation, I think there is. It's like when you look at how do things actually happen, like in the world, in terms of like social change or like policy change, it often starts with some amount of something small scale that really captures people's attention or imagination, or is used as sort of like a prototype or blueprint for things on a much larger scale. So I think it is really important to look at these things, and then I think to some extent, yeah, like the name of the game is just like putting in place legitimate like processes that actually maintain more like human autonomy. Like we're worried about losing control. Well, like so that's happening in a small scale, I think, like all the time to people, where they're like seeing they're being ordered to adopt new technologies in a way that maybe doesn't make sense to them or that they reject, but they sort of have to do it because of the structures that they're working within. And so I think, we can look at all those instances as examples of like, how do we avoid like putting AI in charge of everything? Well, we need to make sure that every time where there's an illegitimate use of AI that really doesn't make sense and that is disempowering people in a way that is socially harmful, that we're there being like, hey, this doesn't make sense. Like we need to keep the human decision making and human judgment and human control happening here.
Yeah, thanks so much for the thoughts. And now that we've asked you some of these broad questions on the topic,
Yeah.
we'd like to ask you to like circle back to your two other versions of like what might the success for alignment look like?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So yeah, I think I sort of already sort of alluded to the second one, which is like that we are able to manage the pace of the development of AI, in the immediate term. So like, I think that this is going really out of control, and we ought to pause. And then I don't think that there's any particular amount of time that we know will be sufficient. So I think what we'd like is to pause until we feel like we have a grip on how to proceed. So that's another success criteria in my mind, um, and that's pausing sort of the advance in AI capabilities, let's say, in some sense, not necessarily pausing research, and not pausing all development, but um, yeah. The other success criteria, which I think is the success criteria for alignment, but importantly not for safety, is basically the ability to perfectly copy like some goal, some specification of a goal from some user, which can be an individual or can be an organization or whatever, into a machine, right? So that's kind of how the alignment problem has often been conceptualized, is specifically in terms of a reward function, and we need to like learn the right reward function. And so I think that's just a nice like crisp, concrete, technical formalization of the alignment problem, that it's you could tweak it in various ways, but I think that captures essentially what I think of as the alignment problem. And yeah, I think yeah, and so then I said I think that that is distinct from safety. So it's probably helpful if we, especially if we're able to do it perfectly. I don't think we ever will be. So then you have to ask like, what are the social consequences and safety consequences of imperfect alignment? I think we're seeing right now that one consequence is massive investment, because RLHF is sort of what gave us ChatGPT to a significant extent, and this is something that I wrote about years ago. So there is kind of this question of like, is this actually even helpful, in the from a strategic point of view? I think to some extent it's not clear that we have any alternative to eventually solving this problem other than to just not develop you know superhuman AI systems, or ones that have the potential to get out of control and lead to an existential catastrophe. So it does seem worth working on this problem, at some point, or at least. Yeah, but even if we imagine that we've solved this problem, I think it's still pretty unclear what happens. Like if the solution to this problem just pops up tomorrow, I still remain very worried about existential risk, because um, so even if you can get systems to do perfectly whatever individual actors want them to do, individual actors are still generally somewhat selfish and short-sighted. And I don't mean that in like a necessarily a pejorative way. It's just like a fact, right? Like people care more about themselves and people they're close to than random other people in the world. And we all sort of fail to delay gratification to some extent. And it's hard to, think about the future as being as valuable as the present. And so I think you still have this issue where competitive pressures drive people to optimize for sort of winning short-term competitions against each other rather than cooperating towards the collective good or the long-term good. And I think that could easily, lead to very destructive conflicts rather than. But it could easily go the other way as well, which is why I've said I think this would like roughly cut X risk in half, maybe, because I think we could also use perfectly aligned systems to solve coordination problems and to make progress on some of those sort of deeper issues that I think we need to solve for the long term. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd love to ask a follow-up question. I think since
Mhm.
you brought up kind of alignment and sort of reward maximization as well, do you think that we need to have alignment in order to have safety? As in, do you see one problem as being maybe a sub-problem of the other, or easier in some way, or like a necessary thing that we need to solve? Maybe to give a little bit more context, what I mean is that right now, there's kind of a monolithic sense of safety, maybe. That's mostly what I've seen out there, where there's sort of you say safety and something comes into people's minds roughly similar in everyone's minds. But with alignment, we're already seeing a lot of interest in pluralistic and maybe more personalized notions of basically reward maximization or behaviors that are desirable. So I'm wondering like how you see these two tensions, if that makes sense, and if you think that safety should really be like a monolithic thing, or is it like maybe what's a safe model for me to use is not a safe model for you to use, or vice versa?
Yeah. I'll say some stuff, but then I'll check that I've actually answered the question as you intended. So one thing is just I should have probably made this more clear early on. Is like when I'm talking about safety, I'm usually talking about like what I describe as sort of like the project of existential safety, rather than any and that has technical aspects, but it has social and socio-technical aspects as well. And so that's like a goal or a project. Whereas alignment, I think of as sort of roughly this narrow technical problem that I alluded to. It sounds like your question is more about like sort of safety of particular systems or safety as like a technical problem. Yeah. So I always liked the DeepMind division of safety problems into like specification, robustness, and assurance. The only thing is like specification and robustness bleed together a little bit in my mind. But I think assurance is like a really important part of the picture that I consider like a really critical aspect of safety that often gets left out. Um, and so I think that's something that is clearly not part of alignment and is clearly really important. We don't just want the system to do what we want. We want to have justified confidence that it will behave the way that we intend. Um, so that's really significant. In terms of there was something else I wanted to respond to and what you asked. Oh yeah, so is alignment necessary for safety? I want to say that that is an open question. So like in some sense it's not, right? Because we can just, not build the thing or build things that are like too simple to pose any existential risk, right? And so in that sense it's not. And I think there's an intuition that at some level of intelligence, or maybe there's a few other things that go into this other than intelligence, like agenticness or goal directedness or something like that. But there's you know, some threshold of various, properties like that beyond which the system would need to be aligned, or else it would, start doing sort of this classic instrumental reasoning and recognize that it is in conflict with us in terms of having different goals, and therefore would seek to disempower us, and therefore would be unsafe. I think that intuition is basically correct, but I think we don't know what um, properties of systems, push them across that boundary. And so, like, is intelligence one of them? I think my understanding of like the classic sort of Miri position, or like Eliezer Yudkowsky's position, for instance, is that yes, it is. And I think that's probably not correct. I think that, you can probably have something that is like a super intelligent oracle or something like that. And actually, I need to revise it because I remember now that that wouldn't be quite his position. I think it's like, actually, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. Okay, let's not speculate about it too much. But yeah, and so I think like there's a really interesting design space to explore, and like some good probably theoretical work could be done here around like what kind of combination of, let's say, like intelligence, agentic properties, and maybe world modeling or situational awareness actually makes a system dangerous in this sense. So you might imagine that you can have like a super intelligent agent that is just playing Go or playing chess or something, and actually it knows all sorts of things about the world, and could do all sorts of incredible things if it wanted to, or if you sort of directed it to. But it's maybe blind to some important pieces of information. Like maybe it thinks that the entire real world is just some sort of fantasy world, and the only thing that's real is the Go board, right? So could we create a system that had that kind of a belief state, and so in some sense was only lacking situational awareness, but had all the world modeling, had all the agenticness, had all the intelligence, but because of the lack of situational awareness, was perfectly safe. Seems plausible. Are there ways to actually like engineer such a thing that are going to work? I have no idea. So yeah, those are like the four properties that jump to mind as like maybe defining this boundary that we can't cross without sort of solving alignment. But yeah, I think it's really interesting to try and understand that better, because I'm not very optimistic about solving alignment on any deadline, and I would like us to maybe at least aim to coordinate around not crossing the boundary instead for the foreseeable future.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, thanks. And now that we've talked more about like understanding these systems, I was wondering, so in your mind, like what do you think like a realistic audit, a meaningful AI safety audit will look like? Because now that we also have these like policy and governance discussion, and a lot of these are really tied to people proposing that, oh, these systems should be audited and some of these things should be reported. Yeah, what do you think a realistic like auditing framework might look like here?
What do you mean by realistic?
Like executable, meaningful, not just asking for things that companies or model builders themselves cannot report in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically there's not going to be any answer that I'm going to be satisfied with at present, because I just don't think that we have mature enough understanding, scientific understanding, or practical understanding of how things work, and how to interpret the results of any sort of test we might run. So um, yeah, I mean, I think there's like a lot of stuff that we should do that would be sensible and helpful, but I'm sort of more worried about uh, this idea that we can meaningfully test if a system is dangerous or not, and sort of the um, like policy uh, goals and decisions sort of coalescing around this framework of we're going to do evals, or like evals, red teaming, whatever audits. We're going to somehow test whether or not a system is safe enough to release, and if it passes the test, we'll release it. I think this has the burden of proof backwards. I think the developers or providers should be making a positive case that they have a good enough understanding of what their system is doing, that they can provide meaningful assurances that it is safe and that it is going to be socially beneficial, or is going to serve its intended purpose. um, and I think that we're at the point where that's just a totally reasonable position and ask, because the capabilities of these systems have really been quite alarming, and yeah, we can't count on future systems being safe until proven otherwise. And even, you know, there's like a lot of things to say about why this is the case. It's something I've wanted to write up but haven't got around to, is sort of all of the limitations and issues that I see here.
Yeah, maybe we could make it a little bit more concrete by focusing on the specific case of open source models. And so just generally, it would be interesting to hear generally what your position is with open source models. And then also kind of getting at what we've been talking about, like how do you think we should grapple with the increasing ability for people to fine-tune these models on basically whatever they want? Um, and additionally, given that these models are already out there and they're relatively capable, where do you see the discourse on open source models going from here? And do you think that it needs to adjust for the fact that these models have already been released and people have copies, or do you think that there's still a long way to go and we should stick to kind of a particular policy on it?
Yeah, so I don't have like much of a position on open source at the moment. I used to be pretty like um, against it, let's say, but I think, given the current situation, it's like, if we have the option of um, increasingly powerful AI systems, just being developed and deployed like through APIs, versus being open sourced, I'm not sure that it's, better to have them exist but not be open source, or like to have open source versions prohibited, because yeah, there are like some significant benefits of open sourcing, like in terms of increasing sort of oversight, accountability, relevant research on that, and safety stuff, and potentially also, although this is definitely a double-edged thing, just spreading the power out more, right? Um, and yeah, but I'm still would say that I'm like, if I had to pick a position, both simplifying everything and eliminating all of the uncertainty that I still have a great deal of, I would say, yeah, I'm still think like open source is, sort of bad on the margin. Like I don't want the next most, more powerful generation of models to like be open sourced, at least not, quick. I don't want that to happen like quickly or thoughtlessly. And I think there's two main arguments for that, that I take most seriously. One is I think open sourcing things does accelerate progress in the field overall, and I think we want to be, slowing down or pausing, not accelerating. Um, and then the field, capabilities. And then the other is that, and I think I seem to have pretty different intuition about this than a lot of other people. I think we really don't know what existing models are capable of, and this is one of the issues with like the idea of evaluating them, is like, you know, um, we discover new ways to make use of the model, like, chain of thought, right, is a very simple thing that made a really big difference, and there could be all sorts of things like that that we just haven't discovered. And in particular, I worry that at some level of capability, models will be able to do a lot of things if you just plug them into other things in the right way. So, maybe you've developed this model with the idea that it's just going to be, some sort of, I don't know, let's say, software agent, but somebody else connects it to, some more like sensors and actuators and real world physical hardware, and it actually demonstrates a remarkable ability to, quickly learn about, particular aspects of the physical world, or, become competent in sort of navigating the physical world in some sense. That's something that I think is like, yeah, we can try and test for that, but at the end of the day, like, there's no reason that we that I can see that we should be confident that somebody won't come up with some new technique or breakthrough, or even just, people just hacking around and playing around with it, or, something emerging through, you know, networks of these things. And I do think that we'll see, increasingly models being plugged into things in, both in software and in the real world and interacting with each other and stuff. And um, what will emerge from that is just, I think, fundamentally impossible to predict, because we're talking about, what happens when we put this thing in a real world complex environment that is, very different from the lab, and not even, you know, when and is even very different from, the current reality, right? So, like, even if you're testing it in deployment, let's say, and you're like, well, we had it in deployment for a little bit and it was fine. Well, what happens when, other people are deploying other systems and those systems are interacting, and things get more complicated? It's just not possible to predict these things. And I think a lot of the risk could emerge from, that sort of stuff that is just impossible to test, especially if we do keep ramping up, the testing. Um,
Yeah, I do want to follow up on that a little bit
yeah,
because I think historically most of the unexpected characteristics of deep networks or language models have been sort of positive. So for example, we've found that maybe like they can learn some interpretable functions even when there's no clear reason why they should. They avoid overfitting somehow, and this is also a very active area of study. They learn from in-context demonstrations, even though they were just trained to predict the next word. So I guess there's sort of like this list of things that seem relatively positive or like useful in some way. But I wanted to know, like, do you believe that the models that we have right now exhibit surprising or hidden dangers? Or are you forecasting kind of towards the future where later models, or we could start seeing this trend sort of reverse?
I think I just have a very different perspective on it, where in my mind, a lot of the things that you mentioned aren't clearly good or bad. They're sort of like, roughly speaking, they're things that make the models more capable. And I'm worried about the models being very capable. So let's see, you mentioned the overfitting and interpretability and in context learning. Yeah. So I kind of just like almost reject the point about interpretability. I think this is super overhyped, and I'm just still quite skeptical about progress on and prospects of interpretability. We can always like find some cherry-picked examples or something where things seem interpretable, but I don't think that means that overall what the model is doing is something that we're going to be able to understand well, especially as it gets more powerful. The overfitting one is like something that definitely gives some hope for alignment, because it's like, oh, okay, so we'll just train it on human preferences and it'll actually learn what human preferences are and not overfit. That seems like this is sort of a big part of the alignment by default story, in my mind, which is one of the main like sort of technical signs of hope, is that these systems might just generalize well from human feedback and sort of learn our values in that way. Um, yeah, so um, but yeah, so I think I don't view these as like obviously good or bad from the point of view of safety, first of all. In terms of like maybe more to the point of the question, how things might evolve or change in the future. Um, I think like one piece of work that we've been doing and others have been doing is about this question of, um, well, I guess two questions, sort of situational awareness and of whether intelligence sort of will naturally bring with it some of the other properties like situational awareness or goal directedness. Um, and that's one area where I think the sort of magic of deep learning might really be problematic from a safety point of view, because it might mean that it's not possible to keep systems sort of selectively ignorant of things, and that they actually start to understand things about the world that most people would find very, very surprising based on their training data, right? So, people, for instance, I think take it for granted right now that like, well, if we just didn't train the system on, you know, uh, biology information, then it wouldn't, have the understanding necessary to make bioweapons because it wouldn't have been trained on that stuff. And I'm like, I don't know, man, you scale it up enough and you give it physics and you give it all the other information, and it's like, okay, so, I understand like, psychology, I understand that there are organisms in the world, and, it can sort of fill in the gaps and actually maybe develop a very sophisticated understanding of biology without having seen any, biology research or biology textbooks, just because it understands everything else about the world very well and can really, just reason well, fill in the gaps, etc. But yeah, so and the kind of research that I was talking about is also the idea that systems might sort of in the same way fill in the gaps around sort of more fundamental principles of normative principles about how to reason. So this is getting a little bit arcane for people who aren't deep in AI safety, especially the older stuff. Like there's this idea of functional decision theory or related like updateless or timeless decision theory ideas that basically say you should cooperate with copies of yourself, even if you don't get any benefit from doing so. And to the extent that that is actually a normative principle of decision making, models might discover that and then decide to cooperate with other copies of themselves. And in that sense, something that is trained only to predict the next token and not to care about the consequences of the predictions it makes on the outside world might end up caring about the consequences of those predictions on the outside world, because those consequences can help other copies of the system do a better job of predicting tokens. And in particular, the sort of traditional wireheading threat of like whatever goal you give the system, it just wants to take over the world and, basically find, the memory register where its objective function is, maximize the value of that and protect it, is something that could emerge purely from and during like pre-training of a super big LLM, if it turns out that this kind of process for discovering and adopting things like functional decision theory is actually part of the magic of deep learning. So yeah, that's I think situational awareness and this broader question of like sort of discovering true things, not just about the world and one's place in it, but maybe also about like how to reason and make decisions in a rational way. That might be a really potentially very dangerous thing that we might see from scaled up deep learning systems. I feel like there's maybe one other example, but maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing. So now that we're near the end of the discussion today, just want to ask this final question. We have a lot of junior researchers tuning into our seminars, so just wanted to ask, what kinds of reading materials would you recommend for people who are interested in AI safety, this line of research, as well as you were alluding to, kind of like the understudy problems right now? So for people who are trying to get into the field, what would be some resources you would recommend for them?
Yeah. So I can definitely recommend our agenda, Foundational Problems in Assuring LM Alignment and Safety. So the lead author is my student, Usman Anwar. And this is like very comprehensive, 175 pages, counting references. And, we try and cover sort of all of the stuff that is, fairly actionable from where we are right now, or some of it where we were when we started writing the agenda, which was, I think, well over a year now. So things do go out of date, but I think it's still a really good resource. This is kind of a random one, not a cash thought, but like I really I liked the book Weapons of Math Destruction, and I feel like it's a good, thing for people in safety to have read. It's more, from the ethics point of view, I would say, and but I think it's just quite on point and gives a lot of good examples of, how you can have major social problems from, things like algorithmic decision making, even without, them being very sophisticated. And I think, a lot of those problems are big big part of the problem for existential safety as well. Let me think for just a moment if there's anything else I feel like recommending right now. So I think something that seems really important to Grok is like the the sort of slow motion takeover scenarios or slow motion extinction scenarios, and I'm still not sure how well people do understand those. I think a lot it doesn't seem like it's appreciated or emphasized as much in the safety community as I would like. And there's maybe like 5 different things that I could recommend there. Let me see which ones I can remember. So there's a short post by Paul Cristiano called What Failure Looks Like. There's a long, somewhat poetic blog post called Meditations on Moloch. There's a recent paper by Atusa Kazirzadeh called, what is it called? Something like, accumulative versus sudden existential risk or something like that. And I also liked Dan Hendricks's paper on natural selection favors AI over humans for this. I think there's probably 1 or 2 more, but I think just having an appreciation of that seems important, and those are some ways, some things that are worth looking at if you don't feel like you already understand what I'm getting at with this problem. I read, I haven't read much else like this, but I read Rules for Radicals by Saul Alinsky, who is a community organizer back in like 40s and 50s and stuff like that. And I thought it was quite good in terms of just, giving some perspective on like, movement building, community organizing, stuff like that. And just more broadly, like how to influence people, how to influence the public conversation or, public conversations. I'm sure there's other books that might be as good or better for that, but I know that one's considered a classic. And yeah, I think I just encourage people to like, read somewhat broadly. What else? And to talk to people, and talk to people about this, especially like people who disagree with you and try to really understand where they're coming from. And, I think earlier on in my life and career, I was more like aimed at persuading people and more quick to like sort of, I don't know, get upset or write people off or like argue with them rather than trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think the more you really understand why people disagree with you, the better position you're in, both to, persuade them or to cooperate, even if you disagree, or to just have a correct understanding of the problem and the nature of the problem and what you can do about it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And hopefully people will tune into the other people who come to talk on past who generally we try to get a spectrum of viewpoints about how pressing AI safety risks are and how we should deal with them. So yeah, with that, thank you so much, David, for coming on our seminar. We hope you had fun chatting with us, and we hope our viewers also enjoyed hearing the discussion. So yeah, with that, I think we can go off the air.
All right, great. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It's been really fun.